Welcome back as we continue these adventures in renewal together. In this video, we're going to review all the things your team has learned up to this point through listening, and then talking about how those learnings form the foundation for planning some next level experiments outside of your congregation. Before you started this video, you might have noticed that a key thing we want you to have right in hand now is a summary of your group's learning so far. By this point in the process, you have spent some good time dwelling in the Word. You've also spent some time with the listening to one another's stories and naming God's activity exercises. Last, you have done some community mapping and taken at least one prayer walk. At every step, we've encouraged you to keep a learnings log so that you're able to document what the Spirit's been teaching you along the way. If you don't have your group's learnings in all one place to review at the beginning of this video, we'd encourage you to stop the video here and return to it when you have that all together. Here's a recap of some of the things we've discussed up to this point that are especially important as we think about planning our next level experiments. First, we want to remember that listening is central in all of this work. We started by listening to God through dwelling in the Word. We continue by listening to each other inside the church to strengthen our connections and grow in our faith together. Then we make the turn to start actively listening to those outside our churches, to build relationships with them, and trust that God will do something beautiful in those relationships. Remember the quote that we highlighted earlier in the process from David Augsburger? For most people, feeling heard is so close to feeling loved that the two are indistinguishable. This process is about sharing God's love by listening first, which makes people feel loved, and then letting the Spirit lead us on from there. Next, we talked about all the various ways congregations engage in mission. We talked about how some of it looks like working for others, or the traditional charity model. Some of it looks like working with others, which is where the church is a partner with other organizations helping people. And some of it looks like being for others, or advocacy. Then we named how all of these are important and valid expressions of mission, but how all of them need to begin with relationship, being with in the same way Jesus began by being Emmanuel, God with all of us. As the church, we seek to mirror that and send the message to those outside our churches that we are with them, first and foremost, building relationships God will use to bless all of us. The last thing we want to hold space for at this point is your group's learnings. We invite you to pause the video here and go over your learnings log. Remind yourself what we've learned through dwelling in the Word, through the listening exercises inside the congregation, and through your mapping and prayer walks. Once you have grounded yourself in those learnings, unpause the video and we'll move on to planning our next level experiments.
Okay, now that you are grounded in all the things God has been teaching your group up to this point, we're ready to begin planning listening experiments out in the broader community. The goal of these experiments is to help those of us inside the church listen to people first, and then let what we hear from them change us. Sometimes we've described this process of renewal as listening-based evangelism. Listening helps those of us inside the church know how to communicate God's timeless love in ways that our neighbors and friends can best hear it. I want to share with you my own personal experience of the power of this paradigm shift that we're talking about in this process. In particular, one of the beautiful things that happens when we are bold enough to shift from hosting everything to being hosted. As we said previously, this shift means we give up some institutional power and privilege. When we are hosting everything, we are in control. But when we step onto the turf of others with a spirit of curiosity and accompaniment, it sends at least 3 really powerful messages to those outside the church. First, it says to those outside of our churches, you matter to us. You matter. Enough for us to come to you instead of only expecting you to show up on our turf on Sunday morning at the right time, wearing the right clothes. Second, this shift from hosting to being hosted says, we can learn from you too. Yes, the church has some very important things to offer the world, but we don't have a corner on the Spirit's movement in the world. Being hosted in someone else's space says, maybe there's something the Spirit is doing in your life that will bless us too. Maybe we can be co-conspirators together, blessing others together. That is powerful. That brings us to the third message that this shift can send others. It says, we are all in this together, and these gifts are for you too. God and love and grace and mercy aren't just for the church insiders. They're for everyone. And nothing sends that message better than showing up, ready to listen and learn and do life, and even church, with our neighbors. I have experienced this personally while helping facilitate in-person versions of these trainings. One thing we're really committed to as facilitators is making sure to meet in non-church spaces for our gatherings. And what that meant is I had to practice the exact same things I was encouraging other congregations to do. In order to plan for the in-person trainings, I had to be out there, meeting business owners, building relationships, and seeing what doors the Spirit would open. I felt a bit like Paul and his companions in Acts 16. I'd think there was a lead over here, but then it would be clear that that door was closed. But then every single time, and I mean it, every single time, someone would cross my path who became like Lydia for me, where it was very clear God was preparing their heart to be a partner in the work in some way. One of the most powerful examples of this is actually represented by the place we are recording this video. This is an art studio named Inspiration Studios. Through some mutual connections, I came to meet Erico, the owner of this place. We had lunch. I just listened to his story. I inquired if we could rent the space for a training event, and he wanted to know more about the event. When he learned what we were doing, working with churches to get all of us out in everyday life, listening to and loving people, he was so touched by it. Because, like most people, Erico had his own story of a faith journey that was anything but a straight path. Through these conversations that began with me just listening, Erico became a true partner. On our first training day, he stuck around for hours helping set up tables, making sure everything was just right for us. In that particular training, we were talking about how shame is like shackles and how we have to let go of that, trusting that God can always begin again with us wherever we are. When Erico heard me say that during the training, he disappeared into a back room of the art studio right over there. When he emerged, he held a beautiful painting of a man huddled down like that. It was one of his own paintings, and he told us all his story of feeling freed from shame, freed to offer his gifts to the world. It was one of those beautiful moments that reminded me, God is moving in the church, yes, but God is also moving in the lives of people like Erico outside of our churches every single day. I have no doubt, because I've experienced it time and time again, that the listening experiments you will plan will connect you with something beautiful God is doing outside your church, or with someone beautiful who is ready to be your partner in a way you wouldn't have anticipated.
Pastor Matt's story brings up a really important point. Sometimes we can change the narrative and change the script just by changing where we are sitting. One of the people who trained us in this model told us a story about his family that really drives home this point. He shared with us about when his family had just moved into a new neighborhood and wanted to get to know their neighbors, but weren't sure about how to get started. They also had a small child at the time and a fenced-in backyard. That meant that when they were home, they spent most of their time behind that fence so their child could run free. The side effect was they weren't out where they could even meet their neighbors. So they made the intentional decision to simply change where they were sitting. It took a little more work, but they started sitting in lawn chairs in their front yard. Of course, keeping a close eye on their child so they wouldn't run into the street. Sure enough, people who were out walking their dogs or just out for an evening stroll began to notice them. It started with a wave. Then it became, "How are you doing tonight?" And not too much later, it became the beginnings of relationships with their neighbors. All because they changed where they were sitting. This is the power of shifting from hosting everything to being hosted. It may be that this principle alone could lead to an easy experiment. Try holding a meeting that's typically in the church building out in a public space instead. Is there a restaurant or a bar nearby? Go meet the owner and ask if it would be okay to hold your church meeting there. If it's your guiding team for this process that will be doing this, try sharing with the owner what it is you are doing. Being out in the neighborhood, curious how you can be a partner in making the community a better place. Most people are pleasantly surprised that there are Christians who aren't just in it for themselves, but want what's best for the community at large. If you try this kind of experiment where you just change where you are sitting, take time to notice. How do people respond to you? How do those who work there or own the place respond to the request to meet there? What do participants in the meeting notice in themselves? Does it feel different to meet in a public space? What might God be teaching us through this simple experiment of doing our normal church stuff, but out in public? There is a fundamental assumption behind all of this, and it's really summed up in the following statement. The gifts of God come wrapped in people. Think about the beauty of that. The gifts of God come wrapped in people. When we interact with new people, we are standing ready to receive the gifts that God has placed in them. That means that every interaction with someone new is another chance to receive a gift from God. If we let that truly sink in, then we will see that this work of our being out in our communities is a powerful way to receive the gifts God has in store for us and for our congregation. You can start by investing your presence in everyday life with people, but it quickly becomes an opportunity to invest our relationships with those outside our churches as well.
Now it's time for us to talk about what your next level experiment could look like. Look at the paper entitled Action Learning Experiments. This will be the key takeaway from this session as your team works to plan an outside the church listening experiment. Notice the very first line. What is an experiment? An experiment is an action learning experience that is designed to help us behave our way into new thinking. This is different from the way we have usually done things in church. We're used to trying to committee our way into new thinking, but really, that hasn't worked very well for most of us. So, what's the point of these experiments? They are the best way to learn when we are faced with challenges that require us to adapt and do something differently than we have done it before. Experiments like what we will plan today can create space for us to discover new ways to be the church in our context. It is definitely true that we are in a time of big cultural change. And that means we can't assume our traditional models of church reach people like they used to. We need to learn our way forward, and the best way to do that is through experimenting. Look at the next section on that page, because this is really key. What makes an experiment successful? It turns out the success of an experiment is determined by how much we learn and how much we are transformed by the experience, rather than by how much impact our actions have on others. You'll need to repeat this a lot, both to yourselves and to others in the church. See, we're used to thinking that success equals numbers and impact on others, but we're trying to learn how to be the church in a new way that will reach new people. So the first hearts that God needs to change are ours. Maybe this analogy will help. Think about school kids who are in their first science class. What's the point of experimenting in a science class? Is it to break new scientific ground? No. The point of those experiments is learning. The work your team is doing, it's exactly the same. Here's another story to help you get a sense of what this looks like. We know of one congregation that did their first action learning experiment around collecting prayer requests in the broader community. The team was excited that they would be offering their neighbors a chance to be heard and a chance to be prayed for. So after the event was over, they only had about 15 prayer requests, far short of what they had been anticipating. And at first, they felt like the experiment was a failure. But their coach helped them remember, experiments are never a failure. As long as you stay curious, you absolutely can learn. So, what did they learn? When they look back at those 15 responses they did get, they saw that many of the people included a note that said, "Thank you so much for listening." And after really taking time to reflect on the responses they did get, the team concluded that more people outside their church needed to feel heard and valued. After processing that with their coach, the team's greatest learning from this experiment came in the form of a question. How could we become more of a place where people feel heard and valued? That question alone led that church on a year-long journey where more and more of their neighbors got to know them as the place that listens and loves.
Now let's talk about the actual mechanics of planning your next level experiment. On that same page, look at the second half. 3 major steps to designing an experiment. The first step is naming what you want to learn ahead of time. One helpful practice is to try to finish the sentence, "We don't know," or "We want to learn," and then fill in the blank. Try to let this emerge from the listening work you have done up to this point. What did you notice in your dwelling, or community mapping, or prayer walks? What have been some of the questions you've been left with? Spend some time in that conversation so you can decide what you'd like to learn about in the experiment itself. Another brief example might help. One congregation did their prayer walk on a Sunday morning during the time the rest of the congregation was in worship, just to see where else people were on a Sunday morning. In its own way, this is a very early experiment. Their way of finishing the sentence is, "We don't know where else people will spend their time on Sunday morning." And one of the things they noticed was that the streets were largely empty, even though it was a beautiful day outside. They knew a lot of families with little kids lived right around their building, but no one was out riding bikes or playing like they expected. As they kept walking, they heard noise down the street. There was a new community playground that was built right down the street. They kept walking, and sure enough, there were all the families with kids on a Sunday morning. So as they reflected on this learning, they finished the sentence again. "We don't know how to connect with families who play there on Sundays. We don't know what their hopes and dreams are or how we can connect God's love with their everyday lives. So they planned another experiment. They decided to do a Sunday school class in the playground. They wanted to see how it felt different and see if God opened up any conversations with others at the playground that they might learn from. Remember the "we don't know" statement. They were looking to learn more about how to connect God's love with everyday lives of parents and kids. As of this recording, that congregation is still learning and trying new little fun experiments with Sunday school. They are feeling energized, building new relationships with new people, and learning new ways to connect God's love with the everyday lives of their neighbors. So back to the mechanics of planning an experiment. Once you've been able to name that hope for learning, move on to number 2. This is the try part of the learning cycle. Describe the steps you will take in the experiment. The more obvious you are in detailing those little steps, the lower the anxiety will be for those who join you for the experiment. Be really explicit in your plans here. Name where you will go, how you will show up, what you'll do and say there, and what some responses could be if others ask you why you were there and what you are doing. If in your planning you are really clear about exactly what you will do at each step, it will make it easier for your team to invite other people from the congregation into this experience with you. The last thing to remember here is that experiments are meant to be simple, repeatable, and affordable. Try to avoid overcomplicating it. The third major step is planning for the reflection time. This is really key. Plenty of churches have tried new things before, but this learning cycle of listening, trying, reflecting, and sharing reminds us that it is actually in the reflection that learning happens. On this part of the worksheet, take some time to intentionally plan out how those who participated will gather to reflect after the experience. We found that the same kinds of questions we use for dwelling in the Word are really helpful here. What did you notice in the experience, in others, and in yourself? What questions or curiosities are coming to mind now? And what might God be teaching your group through this experience today? Make sure to capture the learnings in your ongoing learnings log as well. To make this more concrete, we want you to take a look at the handouts provided with this video that say Action Learning Experiment Example at the top. One is riding the casino bus, and the other is participating in a community meal. Pause the video here and take a few moments to look over these 2 examples. Circle or underline things that catch your attention. Have a discussion with your team and your coach about what you noticed. Then unpause this video for the last 15 minutes of training before you begin to plan your own experiment.
As we wrap up this video, we want to do 3 last things. First, we'll share a little bit with you about the learnings that came from both of the example experiments you just looked at. Second, we're going to talk about one last key concept that will help you plan your own experiments. And last, we're going to give you lots of ideas for the experiments that might be the right fit for you moving forward, or at least give you something to start with. So first, we want to tell you a little bit about both the Purple Bus and Community Meal experiments. We have talked with the leaders from both and believe they are 2 good examples for how experiments can teach us in different ways. For the Purple Bus experiment, the pastor admitted it was a high bar experiment. It definitely asks people to get out of their comfort zone to talk to strangers on a bus. He told us maybe that was a little too big of a jump right away, but we laugh about it now. Most importantly, he shared with us that the big learning from this experiment was not something that led to a new Purple Bus ministry or anything like that. His team realized through the experiment what a homogeneous group they were, that none of them knew anyone like the folks who were riding the casino bus. They began to wonder, how do we become the kind of people who want to enter new spaces and get to know new people? And then the pastor shared these words of wisdom that have stuck with us ever since. He said, it's not that we don't want people to come to our church, but if all we ever focus on is how to get people in, then we will probably be bad at it. We simply want to be the kind of people who are curious about others. Basically, they kept asking themselves, how do we become the kind of folks who ride purple buses just because we want to get to know people better? The leader then told us, we also learned that a church full of curious, engaged people is pretty interesting to those outside our walls. Another leader in the room then added, yeah, the goal isn't to change others so they want to engage with us, but to change us so we want to engage with others. That was the big learning from the Purple Bus experiment, and it's something that's been teaching us ever since. We offer this to you as well as something that may be helpful to repeat over and over and over again as we learn this new way of being church together. The community meal experiment was a little different, a little bit of a lower bar kind of experiment. Just go as a meal participant, sit and have lunch with folks, get to know them a little bit, and see what you notice. It was interesting that while planning for this experiment, several members expressed doubt that anyone there would want to talk to a stranger. But in their reflection time afterward, almost every single person excitedly shared they found exactly the opposite. When they asked, what did you notice today? One team member said that everyone they interacted with lit up when someone just showed an interest in them. This became a key learning for the group and a key learning to guide future ministry. The participants also learned that even though the meal was free, most people were there more for the sense of community than for the food. Because of this, the group began to ask themselves, where else are people finding a sense of community outside our churches, and how can we join in with what God is doing in those spaces? That question alone has led to an unleashing of energy for ministry that has brought new life to all those who participated. And it turned out the woman who was in charge of the community meal site was so touched by the group's genuine interest that she shared her own faith story and was open to future partnerships with the congregation as well.
Both of those experiments highlight two important things that we want to close with. First, there is a difference between listening to fix and listening to build relationship. Often in the church, we do the first one. We listen long enough to hear a problem that we think we can help fix, and then we dive in to do our best to help fix that thing. That comes from a good and caring place in us, but let's think for a moment about how our most significant relationships in our lives work. Whether it's with a good friend or a partner, we all know that listening to fix is very different from listening to build relationship. In this mission renewal work, we want to watch out for that temptation to jump in and fix things. Instead, we're wanting to build relationships first. Remember the difference between working with, working for, being with, and being for in the last video? This is the same thing. Your coach can help your team watch out for this impulse to do things for others. Mission renewal is always about relationship. And that is being with first and foremost. Then, if we're going to get into doing things, we begin to do them with our new community partners rather than for them. The last thing we want to lift up are some of the tools that are posted along with this video that can be helpful as you turn to planning your own listening experiments. Take a look at the page labeled Action Learning Experiment Options. Notice the opening words on that page. We are inviting you to think of your experiments in two major categories: investing presence and investing relationship. Maybe you found in your listening work that there are places in your community where you feel God might be inviting you to invest more of your time to better understand what God might be doing there. That first section lists some ideas of places you might have noticed. Maybe an early experiment could just be simply investing your presence in one or two of those places to watch for what God might be doing there as people gather. Below that, you'll see that there's some guidance for how you might lean in with curiosity. Then, there's the suggestion that you maybe spend 30 to 60 minutes there 3 times and ask the questions listed just to see what you notice and what you learn. Now, look at the second page of that same sheet. Maybe in your listening work you came across people who you think God might be inviting you to be better connected to as a congregation. If that's the case, then this second category of investing relationship might be helpful. Maybe it's someone you interviewed in the earlier listening work or someone you came across during the neighborhood walk. Maybe it's a community leader of some kind, like the person who ran the community meal in the example that we shared just a moment ago. Someone you've gained a small connection with in this work who seems pretty open to what your church is doing. Then, there is some guidance on that page for how you might lean into that connection in a way that will teach you and your congregation something as well. Last, look at the third page with the same heading. This one has lettered options on it, A, B, C, D, etc. This is simply a list to help you and your team begin to brainstorm what some options might be for a next level experiment. We want to close this video with a scripture and a blessing for the work ahead. Most of the work of your team from this point forward will be planning listening experiments, reflecting on what you're learning, sharing those learnings with others, that's really, really key, and then planning a deeper experiment that can engage more people in your congregation and further spread this method of curious listening-based ministry. Really, that's the whole goal, is for your team to slowly infect the rest of the congregation with this same process of curiosity and listening-based evangelism. Make sure to take pauses in the process along the way to review your learnings log and plan together as a group how to share those learnings with other teams in the congregation and with the congregation as a whole. That is how your group can and will be like a fountain of new life for the church. That's how you can, little by little, infect the rest of the congregation with this kind of approach to ministry. And you can use it for any ministry challenge. There will be additional videos as supplemental resources, but you now have what you need to move forward in the learning cycle of listen, try, reflect, and share. The scripture we're going to close with as a blessing is Acts 16, verses 12 to 15, the tail end of the scripture your team and your congregation have likely spent a fair amount of time in by this point. After all of their travels, it says that we then went to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira, and she was a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you've judged me to be faithful in the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. That same Spirit has been leading the church for 2,000 years. May you continue to lead your congregation in curiosity, in going outside the city gates or outside the church walls and talking with the people who are gathered there, and in working together with every Lydia the Spirit places in your path. The work we are doing as congregations has never been more important. We know from health experts and even the Surgeon General of the United States that we are in the midst of a cultural moment in which loneliness and social isolation are widespread. Yet, we bring good news of a God who is for us and for all people. We bring good news of grace, mercy, and love that we don't have to earn in a world that tells people they have to earn or be worthy of everything. May God continue to bring those blessings to you when you need them and through you in this listening work. As we follow the Spirit, it's always an adventure in renewal. Summary notes. We started by reviewing the learnings from all of our listening activities to this point because listening is central to all of this work. What has God revealed to your team through dwelling in the Word, the listening to one another's stories, and naming God's activity exercises? Second, we named that this work is essentially listening-based evangelism, and that the shift from hosting everything to being hosted sends powerful messages to our neighbors that we are all in this together and that God's love is for them too. Then, we talked about how to plan action learning experiments and that the success of our experiments is measured by how much we are transformed, not by how much impact we have on others. We named that in the work of church renewal, the first hearts God needs to change are ours. As we laid out how to plan an experiment, we highlighted the importance of first, naming what you hope to learn and connecting that to your listening work that's happened so far. We talked about how important it is to be detailed in your planning of the experiment, to make it easier for your team to invite others to participate with you, and how important that is. Your team's impact will only stay within your team if you aren't regularly inviting people from the congregation to participate in the experiments and regularly sharing your group's learnings back with the whole congregation. We also gave a few examples like the purple bus and the community meal experiments so that you begin to get a sense of how to really get the learning out of any experiment you do. And last, we named the difference between listening to fix and listening to build relationship, and how this process of renewal is meant to always nudge us toward relationship. There are many other resources posted with this video, including lots of starter ideas for experiments.
And we know it may be helpful to re-watch this video every so often because this model of listening to learn and to build relationships is new for many of us.
Here's your field work. Using your learnings log and all the other resources posted with this video, spend several meetings with your team to plan your next action learning experiment. Invite others from the congregation to participate with you. This is how your team begins to infect the congregation with the spirit of curiosity and listening-based evangelism. Make sure to schedule time following the experiments to mine the learning from them. Make a plan for how your team can share the learnings and the energy back with various leadership groups, teams, and the whole congregation. Feel free to re-watch this video or any of the previous videos to remind yourselves of the learnings there. Share the videos with others in the congregation as they become more curious.